We'll just give everyone a few seconds to join, and then we'll get started. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining from various points beyond. My name is Zachary Pakin. I am a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, in Brussels, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you this morning or this afternoon or this evening to an extremely timely panel with four world-class panelists whom we are very, very lucky to be able to welcome to CEPS today. For those of you who are observers of international affairs, which I assume is most, if not all of you, you will note that the Chinese Communist Party just held its 20th Congress. For those of you who are students of history, you'll know that the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was certainly a very important historical event, and it may well be the case that history is repeating itself here as well. Who knows in which ways precisely. But in order to unpack this momentous development in China's relationship with the world, as well as its particular impact on the future of China's approach towards the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, I am very, very lucky to be able to welcome with us today Bonnie Glaser, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. She's formerly with CSIS and is now the director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Bonnie, welcome to CEPS. Bruno Masjes is the senior advisor at Flint Global. He was also Portuguese Secretary of State for European Affairs from 2013 to 2015, and the author of well-known books such as The Dawn of Eurasia and Belt and Road. Bem-vindo, Bruno.
Yeah.
Hui Wang is founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, and he is joining us today from Beijing. Huan Ying. And last but certainly not least, Andrei Kartunov is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, RIAC, and he joins us from Moscow. Добро пожаловать, Andrei.
Good evening.
So, Henry, you're on the ground in Beijing right now, and I'd like to start with you. The key takeaway from the CCP Congress that most people in the West appear to be mentioning is that Xi Jinping has significantly succeeded in consolidating domestic power. I'm wondering if you think that is how things are seen in China as well.
Well, I think there's certainly, if I use one key word is continuity, and of course we see the basic policy remain consistent. We have continue. I think President Xi emphasized opened up. The door will be open wider. He mentioned that twice actually at the report, also at his acceptance speech there. So that's something I think you can expect. But also I think this 20th Party Congress has proposed new objectives of 2035 and 2049. Basically, they're going to have pursue high quality development rather than high speed development. But also, furthermore, I think they have also mentioned that they're going to build up a common prosperity. Basically, it means that they have lifted the 800 million people out of poverty in the last 4 decades. Now they're probably thinking about how we can lift the 300 million migrant workers into middle class. China has created a 400 million middle class, but we still have 1 billion left behind. How we can upgrade that to avoid deglobalization and anti-globalization sentiment among its own population, and try to learn the lessons and from some other countries probably. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on that, but also there's more. I see a huge attachment on the education, talent, innovation. China has said it has trying to build the largest education system, health system, and social security system. So there's a lot to do to upgrade that, And of course, I also see that this Congress is, of course, we have promoted many new standing committee members and new Politburo members. But you can see one of the characteristics, they're all from developed area, either from those very coastal developed area with a lot of private sector experience, multinational experience in those very developed area in China. But also there's a number of high quality, like the mayor of Beijing now today has been announced to become the party chief in Shanghai. And Mr. Chen, he has spent 10 years in Imperial College at London, got a PhD there. And so now he's the party boss in Shanghai. And so and then we have there could be new leaders come in. So there's a lot of highly trained, highly competent those regional leaders on coastal area now assuming the new posts. So I would think if all those leaders come into place and we will have a new synergy, maybe new objective plans, a new cohort of leadership. And I think China probably march on towards a very stable, very long-ranging plan again to make things forward. I think on the international front, of course, again, the policy we've been seeing that in the last, trying to engage more, globally, to more multilateralism, and then trying to work with different countries. I would just mention that just in the next 10 days, we're going to have 4 top leaders visiting China, foreign top leaders like the Party Secretary General of Vietnam, and we have the President of Scholz of Germany, Chancellor of Germany, and also President of Pakistan, and President of Tanzania visiting. So, and then we'll have top leaders going to G20, probably have a lot of meetings, also go to APEC summit. You can see a busy season started already. we felt that, those international outreach is starting to happen. So we hope that situation, we see a lot of international flights increase now, and there's more delegation going out. There's China also welcoming more coming in. I hope, things will getting better as time goes on, probably by the end of the year or beginning of next year.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Henry. And let me turn now to Andrei. Could you help us unpack a little bit what the Kremlin's main takeaways from the Congress might be?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that I'm old enough to remember some of the Soviet Party Congresses. And I think that I know more or less how these major reports of party leaders are being prepared. They are a result of a lot of bureaucratic struggle. And there is a lot of interagency action and interaction and bargaining behind these documents. So what you see is important because it gives you a sense of where the party is heading to. Every word matters. Every paragraph is important, and I'm sure that scholars will study this document with precision. Let me say that it is important that if you look at the section on foreign and defense policies of China, they're in the very end of the document, and they're relatively short. The leader clearly indicated that his top priorities and priorities of his team are inside the country. And I think he sends a signal primarily to the Chinese population, primarily to the members of the Chinese Communist Party. And although it is also important to send a signal to Chinese international partners, but I think it's the second tier of his audience. It is also important that basically the international section is very moderate. I think that the leader tried very hard to avoid any statements that could have been interpreted as inflammatory or radical or belligerent. And if you look at the reference to Taiwan, I think it's very indicative that he was very, very cautious not to emphasize the option of a military action against Taiwan. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, I think that there are at least 3 takeaways that the Russian leadership should have after having read this document. First of all, in the bilateral relationship, Russia is likely to be a deal taker, not a deal maker. China will try to define the rules of the engagement, and these rules might be benign, they might be benevolent, but they are likely to be pragmatic. Second, Russia should have no illusions about the level of the Chinese support. China might support Russia in its standoff with the West, especially with the United States, but not in its military operation on the Ukrainian territory. The leader was very clear about the Chinese emphasis on peaceful resolution of international disputes, on respect of international law and integrity, territorial integrity and sovereignty of all the nations of the world. So I think that this is important. Finally, I think it should be clear that Russia has to do its homework. If Russia really wants to expand its relations with China, it has to put more emphasis on its domestic reforms, on its adjustment. It should become more valuable for China as an international partner. I hope that these lessons will be learned by the Russian leadership.
Okay, lots to unpack there, and we'll get into a lot of that just very shortly. But let me turn very briefly before we get into the meat of the matter to both Bonnie and to Bruno, just to get their senses of what's taken place in Beijing over recent days. So Bonnie, over to you first. What turned out as expected? What surprised you from the Congress?
Well, we had some in the United States efforts to predict who was going to be on the Politburo Standing Committee. Maybe there was even some betting involved, but I can tell you that I know not one person who got the members of the Standing Committee right, not all 7 of them. It is clear that Xi Jinping ran the table on the personnel arrangements, and loyalty was the most important issue for him. 3 prior personal secretaries to Xi Jinping are on the Standing Committee. The fact that Li Qiang will be a premier is remarkable, since he is the first person to hold that position since 1976 who is not being promoted from a vice premier position. So he may have extensive experience in cities, but he does not have national governance experience. Never been in the state council. The youngest person on the Standing Committee is 60 years old, and of course that tells us that Xi Jinping deliberately shied away from having anybody on the Standing Committee who could be seen as a possible successor. He himself was 54 years old when he was put on the Standing Committee in 2007. So nobody is designated to be the next leader. That should surprise no one, but it tells us that Xi Jinping will likely be in power at least 10 years. Some people think maybe for life, but of course we don't know that. I thought the political report was the most ideological in tone and content than any we have seen in the last 40 years. That, I think, was really quite notable. There's also, for those of us who have paid attention to the descriptions of the international situation in the past, I sensed that there was some triumphalism as well as a sense of foreboding. So the report says, rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is on an irreversible historical course, but yet there are great concerns about the future. Xi Jinping said China must be more mindful of potential dangers in the midst of peace. He talked about the grave international developments that pose immense risks and challenges, and China must be prepared to face major tests of high winds, waves, even perilous stormy seas. So this tells us something about what he sees, I think, the relationship with the United States going forward, but also other countries. And obviously we can talk more about that. Finally, since Andre mentioned the military section, I just want to say this is actually very significant because we haven't had a real dedicated military section. It previously, certainly not in the prior political report. It included the first mention of an intent to establish a strong system of strategic deterrence. We believe that this refers to the ongoing expansion of Chinese nuclear forces. So this is really quite significant. There was confirmation of the 2027 modernization goal for the PLA, which means we have 27, 2035, 2049. A reference to military civil fusion, although they didn't use that phrase, but that concept is still in there. This is of great concern to the United States and underpins the export controls that were announced on, of course, to limit China's access to semiconductors just a few weeks ago. And finally, the first ever reference to a plan to deploy Chinese military forces on a regular basis and in diversified ways. So I will echo what Andre said about the importance of this political report, the effort that goes into it, and that every word is important. And those of us who study China and want to understand what Xi Jinping will do going forward, it is extremely important to study this very closely.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bonnie and Bruno. Last but not least, should we expect more of the same in Xi Jinping's third term, or some deviations in some respects?
I think there will be changes. I'll be brief. I think Chinese scholars will probably start speaking about the end of coalition politics. There are no more coalitions. There are no more factions. Xi Jinping in full control. Bonnie said 3 former secretaries, probably 4 former aides of some kind, and the other 2 members of the standing committee are very close to Xi Jinping as well. At the same time, perhaps would be precipitation to talk about ossification, or a sort of Soviet derivation of some kind. Average age is younger than before, both in the Central Committee and the Politburo. And there's a reinforcement on the idea of openness. I was also very struck by the sentence, "The door will be open wider." That was present in both documents in the closing speech as well. I think it's relevant that those people that we used to think of as close to the West, in some cases admirers of the West, and that were engaged in a kind of process of emulation, of bring some Western practices to China. And I think they have disappeared. They went into early retirement. Li Keqiang and Wang Yang. Those are people that we thought as people who understood and who admired the West. And that will have an impact, I think. I always thought, as my experience in China as well, that party members that are younger are much more suspicious and much more confrontational with the West. So this was inevitable, but it's now happened that there's a new generation, and this generation is not the one we're used to.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And all of your responses touched on different aspects, which I think is very useful. And we're particularly grateful to be able to have leading American, European, Russian, and Chinese experts on the same platform to discuss an issue of tremendous short-term security importance, which is the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, and an issue of tremendous long-term importance as well, which is China's foreign policy and its interaction with the rest of the world. So, again, allow me just to reiterate how grateful we are to have all of you today. And I hope that we'll have a very informative and also respectful discussion. Moving back to Henry, and let's shift indeed now to the situation in Ukraine, because in some key respects, both in terms of economic assistance, in terms of the rhetoric that Beijing has deployed, China has clearly lent Russia a hand in this conflict. So I'm wondering if you can help Western publics in particular understand why China considers its strategic partnership with Russia to be important.
Well, I think there's a lot of probably misread and misunderstanding of what's going on this February 4 statement. As a matter of fact, you probably all remember last November when President Biden and President Xi had this first virtual summit, seeing each other on the screen. And President Biden said, 4 no's and one not interfering, whatever, no Cold War, no, not going to contain China. So all those great stuff. And but the moment President Biden went back to Washington, he said, "Okay, we're going to boycott the Beijing Olympics." So that was a slap on the face of Chinese. I mean, they just had a very warm discussion on all those assurance. But then, the moment next is, no Beijing Olympics. But you see, China spent 7 years preparing this Olympics. It's such a face issue and pride and everything. Huge investment went in that. And then Putin comes out and says, "Wait, no, we're coming. We're going to support Beijing. We're going to support Beijing Olympics, Winter Olympics." So that's where President Putin came. And I think China was reciprocal. And China was giving all those, I think they had a great discussion and, friendship, no limits, and cooperation, no limits. So that's quite often China used that. I mean, with everlasting friendship. I mean, that's a diplomatic language they use a lot. So I really don't think there's a knowing beforehand that President Putin going to take this special operation, or China is deliberately working with Russia for that. Because one of the simple reasons is that Chinese citizen was the last to put out of Kyiv. Almost quite a few get killed. If China knew, I mean, China would probably put out in the first place. So China was actually always repudiate, what the U.S. was saying. There's an invasion imminent. China doesn't really think that. So So that's what happened. But then, of course, when this happened, Chinese government said again, there's no substantial military or material support to Russian. China Foreign Minister Defense Minister said in the Shangri-La, he said China absolutely provide no material military support to Russia. So that is really openly said that. And then you can see also at the recently closed Shanghai Cooperation Summit, President Putin even mentioned, you Chinese only taking a neutral stand. I understand you have concerns, you have a problem. Let's talk in private. I mean, President Putin said that on camera. So China doesn't really have the same position as Russia. You can see very obviously. And then Foreign Minister Wang Yi met Ukraine Foreign Minister in the UN. Basically said four principles. Number one, let's respect sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine is no exception. Has to be respected. Second, let's really get UN Charter really upheld and against all those anything to on top of this kind of a principle. I mean, that's not really popular and not welcome. So thirdly is of course we China support a more balanced security. Every country has a concern on that. It should be more balanced. And finally, China would like to participate in mediating, promoting the peace of that. So I think China has been very. The only thing that China has really a little different than Western countries is the sanction. China doesn't want to have a sanction because China is already the largest trading nation with so many countries, including the whole West. They don't want to see the world in trouble and in recession and all those issues. So I think that Chinese stand is very correct as Chinese thinks, because you can't expect China 100% lined up with US, because US has really put China as the number one enemy now. I mean, rivalry. Even while they're so busy on Russian, I mean, President Biden still find the time to go to Asia to have this IPAF and the Quad and everything to really contain China. So I mean, what China think? I mean, China was pushed together with Russia to some extent, but I think still for that, China has its own principle. China uphold sovereignty, territorial integrity, and all those UN principles. So I put an op-ed in New York Times in March. I said, maybe China could help. What I meant is that maybe let's really get UN and 7-party talks. P5 plus Ukraine plus EU, and let's get a ceasefire. Let's get the UN Secretary General went to Kyiv, went to Moscow, and the Chinese Foreign Minister actually tweeted, this is a great initiative. So I think maybe we really should come back to the UN framework. But let's have a 7-party talks, and then let's get this really peacefully sorted out. It's really Russia now is kind of have this special opportunity, namely is with Ukraine, but in fact NATO is behind it, the West is behind it. So China is the only third party not involved on both sides, and then it's really good for China to come in to really calm both sides down. And I think this is really relevant. So that's my personal observation.
Okay, we'll come back to some of those themes later, but let me just stick with the theme of the Sino-Russian partnership right now. Andrei, I've always particularly been a little bit skeptical of the notion that Russia is destined to become China's so-called junior partner with time. But the reality is that the logic underpinning the Sino-Russian partnership was developed substantially long before February of 2022 and the complete collapse of Russia-West economic relations. So given the impact of Western economic sanctions over the past 8 months, do you think that Russia is prepared to live with a situation where it is increasingly dependent upon China?
Well, the current trends suggest that Russia will depend on China more than it did. If you look at the statistics, you'll see a very rapid increase in the bilateral trade. And this year it might get close to $200 billion already. It becomes significant not only for Russia, but for China as well. Russia will probably make close to 4% of the overall Chinese trade, compared to 2.5, 2.6% last year. So it's a significant increase, and of course there is a lot of asymmetry in this trade. China is in a position to set the terms, especially when we're talking about hydrocarbons and partially also other commodities that Russia might offer to China. And I think that politicians in Moscow understand the risks associated with this over-dependency on China. So there are attempts to diversify the Asian portfolio of the Russian trade and of the Russian foreign policy in general. We've seen that the first foreign trip that President Putin made this year was a trip to New Delhi, and only later he came to Beijing. So that indicates the importance of India as a Russian partner, though, of course, in economic terms, the Russian-Indian trade cannot be even compared to the trade between Russia and China. But thinking about the future, I think, and again, maybe my co-panelists will not agree with me, but I think that there are only two scenarios in which China might change its current quote-unquote neutral position in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And I think both scenarios are not very likely. The first one is Russia employing tactical nuclear weapons in the battlefield, and that will force China to take a much stronger position on Russia. And I think this is one of the considerations behind the apparent unwillingness of the Russian leadership to consider this option, not the only one, but one of a couple. And second, of course, if there is a direct military clash between China and the United States, it is a game changer. And then all the bets are off the table. That might trigger a much closer cooperation between Moscow and Beijing, not necessarily on the issues of Ukraine, but on general issues of confronting the West, information, intelligence sharing, maybe some cooperation, military technical sense. But as I said, in my view, these options are not very likely. I also have a question which I saw in this chart. Globalization will change. How the globalization will change in the Xi third term. My take, and again, I think Henry is in a much better position to answer the question, but I think that what we see right now is that China puts its major emphasis on domestic consumption, not on exports. And if you look at the statistics, you'll see a very significant decline of foreign trade in the Chinese GNP. It is a continuous trend throughout the 10 years of Xi Jinping in power. And I'm afraid that this trend will continue. It doesn't mean that China will close down to foreign partners, but I think that they feel that they should create some guarantees against potentially hostile international environment, so they would try to put more emphasis on expanding domestic markets.
Okay, so Andrei, since you raised the issue in your response just now, let me just turn immediately back to Henry and ask him, because Henry, in your previous response, you did highlight that there are indeed some limits to the so-called no limits partnership between Russia and China. So there is talk of Russia possibly using, under certain circumstances, a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. I'm wondering, in your view, at what point do you think a threshold could be crossed, at which point Beijing will start to view the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine as both a strategic and security threat? And therefore, China would feel incentivized at that point to take certain steps to expedite the end of active hostilities.
Well, I think China has been always a very clear, very strong, seeking a peaceful solution to the current crisis, and of course, China doesn't really, in any favor or in any actually, agreeable mood to see the nuclear being utilized. I mean, China also was the country signing into the agreement not using nuclear, and China also said they're not going to use nuclear first. So I think that is certainly not the option. And what I think now China is already, probably very constrained, very in terms of in terms of military operation of Russian, this crisis, this war going on. China doesn't want to really to see that continue to deteriorate. I mean, as very recently, foreign ministry spokesperson still calls for the Chinese citizens in Ukraine to withdraw. Any still remain, please withdraw and come back. And so China doesn't really want to see the danger there. Doesn't want to see that happen. And I think the UN and probably would be a great platform. I mean, I see other country, Turkey, Israel, and other country getting to mediate. China would certainly like to get mediate on that. I really hope the G20, we can do something on that, since all the leaders are going there. But this thing is that this is not caused by China. China is so far away. There's so much China can do, but
sorry,
definitely.
Henry, can I jump in? Can I just pose the question again? Sure. Is there a threshold in particular that could be crossed? Is there a certain Russian action, something that Russia could do that would cause China to change its approach somehow in the strategic sense? Or is there a certain length that this war could go on for, at which point China will have to say, okay, enough is enough?
No, I think China has already had a very clear position. China, it doesn't really seem that the position that China had used to, at the beginning. I mean, that's obvious. We can see the Shanghai Cooperation meeting. I mean, Putin openly said that you have a different position, and there may be some concern and worry on the Chinese side. So now you can see there's different opinion than what Russian thinks the same. So what I see is absolutely. I mean, if this goes to nuclear, that would be really, the bottom line for all the mankind, and no country will tolerate that. I cannot speculate what China will do, but I certainly think, those are the really bottom lines that we cannot cross the red line. There's a certain red line there.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Bonnie, let's turn back to you now, and let's actually pick up on something that Henry mentioned in one of his previous responses, which is that under both the Trump and Biden administrations, so administrations of two different parties, the U.S. has adopted a visibly more confrontational approach towards China. I'm wondering if, in your view, this has merely served to push Moscow and Beijing closer together, which makes it a lot harder for the U.S. to persuade China in a situation like right now that reining Russia in is in China's interest, right? So, I mean, we understand that China wants to maintain links to Western economy, to Western technology, et cetera. But despite that, what incentive does China really have under the current geopolitical configuration to help the United States solve a European security crisis so that the U.S. can just go back to focusing on containing China?
Well, good set of questions, Zach. I mean, the United States is dealing with a growing set of challenges from China. It's quite clearly described in our recently released national security strategy. And I think that, if the U.S. policy, in my view, has not been the primary factor driving China and Russia together. These are two leaders who share a worldview, who want to decrease U.S. influence around the world, who want to change the international order, make it more favorable to their interests. And so I think if the United States could not pursue a policy of trying to split the two apart, ever since the Russian interference in the U.S. elections, there has been no option for the United States to forge a closer relationship with Moscow. And there is certainly no option of going back to the early 1970s policy of working with China against Russia. So there might be consequences of a U.S. policy of trying to deal with both of those countries that, yes, they could end up working more closely. So we have to think through that possible outcome and how to deal with it. But it would be wrong for the United States, in my view, to try to architect a design, a policy that would prevent the two from working closer, because ultimately their leaders share worldviews. They do share many common objectives. So I think that's not feasible. And I would note, for those of you who have not read the national security strategy closely, that this is a stark difference between the December 2017 NSS and the Biden administration NSS. There is an explicit effort to draw a distinction between Russia and China, saying that they have some common goals, but they're pursuing them differently. Whereas in the Trump administration, Russia and China were said they're both revisionist powers and they were put in the same box. I want to quickly just say a couple of things in response to the things that have been said by Henry and Andre. First of all, I don't think the Russia-China relationship has ever had a no-limits partnership, and it won't have no limits in the future. We all have to understand that there are some limits. And there are things that are important that I think the true leaders agree on, but of course, they're not going to agree on everything. China could step up and play a more responsible role in the Ukraine crisis. Instead, it has looked on from afar, as Henry has said, oh, it's like very far away, you know, it's not really China's vital interest, and has watched Russia continue to essentially to slaughter civilians. Never said anything to criticize Russia's role in this war. Which I think we have to acknowledge. China has professed to be neutral, but behind the scenes, by not taking actions, it is in fact supporting Russia. Why hasn't Xi Jinping called Zelensky? From the beginning of this conflict, there has never been a conversation between those two leaders. And yes, I know that Wang Yi has had a conversation with the foreign minister, but I believe that is not enough. We know that there has been suggestions to Xi Jinping to tell President Putin to not use nuclear weapons or a dirty bomb in Ukraine. My guess is that he has not done so. But if Russia does end up using nuclear weapons, some people will ask the question, did China do what it could to avoid that outcome? At least so far, China is not doing that. And although there has been some suggestion that China could mediate, there's been no serious effort by China to mediate. And I would say China is not a neutral actor and shouldn't be mediating in any case, but you can't just say we could play that role, but then not make any effort to do it. So I don't really see any effort, any serious effort by China to end this war, although it is in China's interests to have this war ended, though certainly not an outcome in which Russia would be the loser. And the worst outcome, I think, for China would be one in which Russia loses its previous gains, especially, of course, Crimea, and Putin potentially even loses power. That would be, I think, the worst outcome for China. So, you know, I find it remarkable that China can still say that somehow this war is NATO's fault. I think there's just, you know, no point in blaming the United States and NATO for supplying weapons. We are not perpetuating this war. This war is Russia's fault. And I think it is time for China to step up and say so.
Okay, thank you. A lot of very useful stuff there, Bonnie. Thank you very much. Let me just turn to Bruno now and focus on the European Union's relationship with China. We have seen the EU try to calibrate or segment its relationship with China, right? It's calling China a systemic rival and an economic competitor on the one hand, but also a partner for cooperation at the same time. I'm wondering, in your view, can these different aspects of the relationship actually be segmented? Is it possible? And does such segmentation, if successful, could it give the EU any leeway to achieve certain, let's say, diplomatic breakthroughs with China on geopolitical issues that the US might not have and might not be able to do anymore due to the level of competition and confrontation right now between the US and China?
Less and less. I think the lines are hardening. I just came back from Brussels today, and a lot of discussions on China, and clearly we're moving towards a world where China is seen as a systemic rival and no longer as a partner, no longer as an economic competitor, but the dimension of rivalry, systemic rivalry, is dominant. The Chinese position on the Ukraine war, notwithstanding what Henry just told us, has been very poorly received in Europe, obviously, for the reasons that Bonnie pointed out. Fundamentally, China is aligned with the Russian position. We understand the reasons. We know that China does not want to contribute to the American effort to solve the problem in Ukraine. Decision makers in Beijing are probably convinced that the US has a problem here and want to watch the US think deeper and deeper into this problem. But it's clear that there's an alignment. It's clear, as Bonnie said, that there hasn't been an effort to underline, like many other countries in the global south have pointed out, including Indonesia. Indonesian president made an effort to talk to Zelensky and has pointed out repeatedly that there's a clear violation of international law and that there are war crimes being committed. There are war crimes being committed, and the Chinese silence is not being well received in Europe. Now, could the Chinese position change? I think it could change towards an even deeper alignment with Russia. I don't see any change in the other direction. And the scenario I can see happening is a widespread collapse of the Russian forces in Ukraine, the danger of a Russian collapse, the potential danger of a regime change in Moscow. Beijing knows that Putin is a known quantity, is comfortable with Putin. I think at that point, it's something to be concerned about, that China would step in more decisively. By the way, just to finish, those very intriguing comments by President Putin when he met Xi Jinping, that he understands the concerns and the questions that China has. Why did Putin raise that up? Why did he make that public? And, in my opinion, there was a reference to Russia's requests for further support. They have so far been denied by Beijing. I don't think Beijing is interested in being drawn into a conflict that is clear and clear Russia will lose. But then the question is, if it becomes clear that Russia is on the way towards a widespread collapse, I think China would probably be forced to step in, but to support the regime. And that could be a very critical moment if we come to that.
Bruno, let me just stick with you because you mentioned that the EU does have less and less room for maneuver right now. What we're hearing increasingly in Europe now is that the EU can't afford to make the same mistake with China that it made with Russia, right? Namely, overdependence, strategic naivete, things like that. I'm wondering, in your view, in the years ahead, will this likely lead to some form of increased decoupling in certain respects between the EU and China, and therefore the concomitant reduction of European influence in Beijing? And if that is the case, is that in Europe's interest?
Well, we have to be very precise and very careful here. Americans keep asking us to decouple, but in fact, the US is not decoupling. China-US trade grew 8% this year. It's going to be the world, the record in US China trade for sure, and by a large distance. What the US is doing, and I think Europe will move to the same position, is not decoupling, but is a certain attention to strategic areas, to the control board of the global economy, and not to allow China to get a foot in those strategic areas, but not wholesale decoupling. That doesn't make sense. And again, it's not being done by the US, not being done by Washington. So why should it be done by the Europeans?
Gotcha. Andrei, back to you. Well, we've now seen, and some people have alluded to this on the panel so far already, we've seen situations in which China, India, some post-Soviet countries now appear more comfortable than before February of 2022, challenging Vladimir Putin and Russia in general in public. If tensions between Russia and China therefore start to grow over the coming months as the conflict in Ukraine continues, I'm wondering, in your view, what strategic imperative does Russia actually have to prioritize? Its goals in Ukraine or its geopolitical partnership with China, which deals on much bigger global issues such as balancing against the United States?
Well, let me start with saying that, in my view, as long as Chairman Xi and President Putin are in charge in their respective capitals, they will do their best to avoid any major rift in the bilateral relationship, because they invested so much in this relationship. They need each other, and I agree with Bonnie that they have many similar positions on global affairs. I wouldn't ignore the differences. The differences do exist, but nevertheless, I think that we've observed a degree of convergence of their views over the last couple of years, and arguably, this convergence continues to take place. I also think that right now there is no need for President Putin to make a choice because he apparently believes, whether he's right or wrong, is an open question. He apparently believes that Russia will be in a position to maintain its positions in regions like Central Asia, South Caucasus, and even Middle East. That the war in Ukraine will not prevent Russia from playing important roles in all these respective regions. And we've seen indicators of this position in Samarkand at the CSO meeting. And I think that unless something changes dramatically, unless Bruno is right and and Russia is facing a crashing defeat in Ukraine, I think this is likely to stay the way it is. Of course, if the situation in the battlefield changes, that might imply certain adjustments. And then dependence on China is likely to increase. And I agree that China is not interested in seeing Russia being weakened or humiliated too much. Putin is clearly the best option that she has. So I think that China can cover an extra mile to make sure that Russia gets out of this conflict with relatively limited damage. Whether that can be done or not, again, remains an open question. It will depend on the situation in the battlefield. And finally, let me say that in my view, China would probably be ready to play a more active role in mediation if it is not the only mediator. If it is engaged in some kind of a multilateral framework, including other major powers of the global south, and maybe not only of the global south. So my take is that China might, at some point, might decide to play a more active role, but not alone.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was an interesting perspective because basically you appear to be asserting that it is more in China's interest to have Russia as an asset that can balance against the United States than a weakened Russia that, you know, increasingly drifts into China's sphere of influence. So that's an interesting perspective.
Well, I think that China would like to have both, and probably it will have both in the end of the day, but it's the issue of measure.
Gotcha. We do have a question from the audience that I do want to pose because it's directly related, Andrei, to what you just said. So let me pose it to you, which is, what do you think the Russo-Chinese strategic partnership looks like after Putin and Xi? Because what Bonnie was referencing to a certain extent was that the convergence between the two countries, while not being driven entirely by the United States, is dependent to a large extent on the leadership of both countries right now. I'm wondering and he is wondering, in fact, our audience member is wondering, what the next generational cohort of leaders in both Russia and China, how they view the Russo-Chinese strategic partnership, and whether there are other factors perhaps that are likely to keep the two countries closer together besides just the personalist relationship between Putin and Xi.
Well, I think that it's a big question, and really it depends on the political trajectories of both countries after the leaders who are in charge right now are going to leave the political scene. And I am not wise enough to speculate about what might happen in China after Xi, because I agree that at least the decisions of the party Congress suggest that he'll be in charge for 10 years, maybe even for more than 10 years. I don't know about Putin, how long he's likely to be in power, but the reality is that it is very hard to speculate about what will happen after. But let me limit myself to saying that no matter who runs Moscow and Beijing, the two countries still have common interests, and they have a long common border. The mutual trade is likely to increase no matter who is in charge. So there is a foundation for this relationship. But it is also clear that both countries are trying and will continue to try to keep their foreign policy portfolios diversified. So a lot will depend, for example, on what kind of leadership we'll have in Moscow after Putin. And again, the situation in China might change in 10 years down the road. So the two sides will have to look for other foundations for their partnership, which should be different from what they have right now.
Gotcha. Henry, over to you. It's been observed by many that Xi Jinping has invested a great deal of his own personal political capital in his relationship with Vladimir Putin in particular, and with Russia and the strategic partnership with Moscow in general. If indeed it is the case that after the CCP Congress that President Xi is in a stronger place domestically, do you think that that gives him more leeway to spend more of his own personal political capital on issues that he deems to be of vital national interest when it comes to foreign policy, right? Even if that includes going up to twisting Putin's arm under certain situations, if he deems that to be necessary?
Well, I think that at Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, I mean, there's a joint statement from China and Russia, and where I think Putin come all the way say, okay, Taiwan issue, core issue of China and all the thing. And President Putin didn't mention about Ukraine, Russian in that statement. So you can see actually it's true. Probably Russia needs more of China now. But again, I think that U.S. cannot say that U.S. has no role in this war. And basically, U.S. supply all the weaponry and all the support, and even said, why not fight until last Ukraine to fight? So I think there's quite a bit of things there, and the U.S. also view China as major rivalry, even during this heart of this war, it still plays China as a primary, and even the openness said, and in the short and long run, China is the major threat to the U.S. So that's really not a healthy attitude to solve any crisis if they want to work with China. I mean, we remember 50 years ago, when Nixon and Kissinger came, I mean, they had the dialogues, they had talkings, they had meetings, and then they come to the conclusion they have to work together. Now, there's no face-to-face meeting. There's not even, the U.S. official hasn't really come to China. Wang Yi now went to New York. So if there's no communication, no understanding, just expect China to do this and that, and then say, look, I'm going to attack you, I'm going to bash you, I'm going to set up the right environment against you. How do you think China can really, totally on the U.S. side? I mean, that's I don't think that's possible. So I think we really need all the world leaders to talk. I really agree that we should have a multilateral approach. I mean, EU, China, India, and Russia, and everybody, let's come together. Ukraine, Zelensky, everybody, let's talk. And the UN should play an important role, and China would be great to. I mean, I'm sure if China at a table, Putin will feel more comfortable because he doesn't face all the people that he's confronting with. Now there's a neutral party there. So I think it's important China can play a role, but China can play a role to end this war peacefully. That's really a balanced power China has now. I would really think that we should have a multilateral approach to solve this crisis.
Gotcha. Okay, let me turn to Bonnie and to Bruno for some concluding thoughts from the two of them. Just policy recommendations, if you can, for the United States in Bonnie's case, for Europe in Bruno's case. How can the US and or Europe manage the various difficulties of their respective relationships with China during Xi Jinping's third term in office, while also finding ways to maximize their ability to gradually nudge Beijing towards a position on the conflict in Ukraine that may be more favorable to their interests? Bonnie, to you first.
Well, I think that we have to be realistic that the United States and China face, as Bruno said, Europe uses the terms, systemic rivalry for its relationship with China. The US has other terminology, but it's essentially the same thing. We are in a long-term structural competition, not just between the US and China. But this is really between the West, broader democracies around the world, and as President Biden has said, autocracies. And we have to engage in a way that we manage this competition so that it does not spiral out of control. And so far, China has been unwilling to engage in a dialogue. Chinese officials ridicule the idea of putting in place guardrails or risk reduction measures that would prevent the two sides from having a real military crisis. I think that's very unfortunate. There is an opportunity, Henry, of course, our two leaders can meet in Bali at the G20. And if they do, it will be the first time they've met in person for some time. But I do hope that we can put a floor under the bilateral relationship and then engage in discussions about other issues. There is no reason to hold cooperation hostage to progress on the bilateral relationship, in my view. China should not make demands of certain things that the United States has to do before it will sit down and talk about climate change. I think that is a position that doesn't serve Chinese interests. It certainly doesn't serve the interests of the rest of the world. And if China wants to be seen as a responsible global power, it will bifurcate these things. It will put some things in the box of bilateral problems with the United States, but also talk about these global issues. We're not talking even about combating drug smuggling anymore, or issues pertaining to proliferation or global health. And in the aftermath of the visit by Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan, China has just cut off all of these dialogues. So it's time to get beyond that and to engage, because the rest of the world wants us to and needs us to, and because it actually is in the interests of our two countries. So I think that we should find a constructive way forward. The United States and China have things that we can work on together, and we do have to, as I said, put a floor under this relationship so there isn't further deterioration. So we have to talk about the issues where we have serious differences that we could go to war over, and Taiwan is one of them. I myself have been, I think, constructively critical, but critical of some of the messaging and the policies that the Biden administration has made toward Taiwan. I've recently published an article along with some other American experts that have made some suggestions about ways forward, because we have to manage this and other issues between our two countries. But we must face the fact we are in a prolonged competition, and we should not try to put a different bumper sticker on it.
Bonnie, before I just turn to Bruno to give him the last word, I was just wondering if I could, because I think it's very useful to get a sense of the context in which the US-China strategic competition is going to take place. You mentioned the rivalry between democracies and autocracies or authoritarian states, but what we're seeing right now in the context of the conflict in Ukraine is India and Brazil, two of the world's largest democracies, refusing to condemn the annexation of territory, which is as clear-cut a violation of international law as it gets. Israel hasn't done very much to help Ukraine either. And the EU is turning to countries like Qatar and Algeria and Azerbaijan to help them with gas. So where is this, democracies versus autocracies rivalry fitting into the emerging global order exactly?
I think that's really fair, Zach. I think that in some contexts, the autocracies versus democracies framing works. When it comes to our own political systems and wanting to protect our democracies and ensure that we are not overly dependent on countries that may try to withhold certain things from us in the future, like we're trying to withhold advanced semiconductors from China. China may try to withhold rare earths from us. That's the sort of systemic rivalry that I think is underway. But when we apply it to other issues like Ukraine, no, it doesn't. It certainly doesn't always work. And there are plenty of countries like in the Indo-Pacific, like Singapore and Vietnam, that just don't neatly fit in that frame of autocracies versus democracy. So it is sometimes useful. It is sometimes not.
Thank you very much. Bruno, last word to you. What do European leaders need to know and what do they need to do?
Well, Chinese policy towards Europe has been very puzzling for 3 or 4 years. We had the 16+1, a disastrous initiative, and I shared that opinion freely when I lived in Beijing with Chinese colleagues, and I think probably they would agree now. The triumphalism in the early days of COVID, which was silly, the Wolf War diplomacy, and now Ukraine, where clearly China has picked Russia over Europe in a direct clash between Europe and Russia. So I think the relationship will now become, of course, much more tense and much more difficult as a result of China's policies, it has to be said. This did not come from Europe. I think Europe is still interested in providing a stable, intelligible framework. Sometimes Beijing and Washington, there's too much interest in confrontation without a clear view of what the end game is, of what is the stable structure we're moving towards. And I think there's a much clearer view in Europe that we have to shape global trade in ways that reflect some of our fundamental values, but we're not interested in decoupling, and we're not interested in a military conflict with China.
Wonderful. That's a very thoughtful and appropriate point on which to conclude our discussion. And again, I'm cognizant of how difficult it can be in these very difficult geopolitical times to bring leading experts from the US, Russia, Europe, and China all together. So we're particularly appreciative that you joined us today. I hope you'll join us at CEPS again. And a great thanks to all of our audience as well for joining us today. So obrigado. Thank you very much. 谢谢 and spasiba. We'll see you all next time.